Okay, today we are looking at these two examples of a lap joint here. It's one of my favorite ones to do. Let's check it out. So here is the first one. Have a good look at it. We can see that after welding it, the two surfaces have been joined. The filler material has added some reinforcement to the joint, and overall it looks pretty clean. All right, let's take a look at a second example of the same joint now. Okay, this one looks a little bit more full, a little more reinforcement perhaps, not quite as hot. So comparing this one that we looked at first to this one here, between the two of them, which one is correct? All right, well, I may have asked you a bit of a trick question here. There's actually something really important that we can do to improve each one of these. So let's take a look at the first one here again. This is an example from an exercise I did with one of my online students. My student had done really well with all of the exercises up to this point, but taking the leap to work on a lap weld is usually a pretty tricky one. Before we were working on basically flat joints and stuff like that, but we are now taking the leap to work on a joint that has different surface levels. And you can see from the example here that we needed to fill up the joint a little better. After a couple of attempts working away on this one here is pretty close to the examples that we were seeing each time he tried it. So take a look at the profile in this diagram here. We can see that the majority of the filler material has gone out towards the bottom edge of the weld. It has fallen overly concave, and we can see this sharp ridge on the top edge here. Now let's take a look at the second example we checked out here. We can see that the bottom line has not reached out quite as far. The filler material is kind of clinging to the top edge, and we can see lack of fusion to the bottom plate here. Now, an interesting fact about both of these examples that we've checked out here. The amount of filler material that is used on each of these is virtually the exact same. So, looking at the both of them, what's the difference? With this exercise, the most important thing is the overall placement. We can see again with this first example here, the heat input and the amount of filler material has been concentrated in a much too low area of the joint. Because of this, all of the filler material settles out to the bottom plate, and unfortunately it doesn't quite reach all the way up to the top edge. Even though we may have a perfect amount of filler material and maybe even heat, when we see an example like this flaw always looks like a lack of reinforcement. Adding more filler material unfortunately isn't really going to do anything to help fix this problem, because you can see looking at it from this angle here, we aren't biting into the top plate as much as we really want to. Adding more filler material will help to fill up the pass a little bit, but because we're placed too far out or too low on the joint, we're not going to be getting adequate fusion into the top plate. All right, let's take a look at our other little buddy here. We can see that with this example, the overall placement is much higher on the joint. It has virtually the same amount of filler material, kind of like I mentioned, but unfortunately this filler material is all stuck to the top edge. We have inadequate fusion to the bottom plate. Once again, the filler material or the reinforcement amount doesn't look too bad at all. Most people typically would just look at the bottom edge right here and simply say that things are just too cold. So the problem with thinking that it's just simply too cold is if we increase the heat thinking that it's going to take care of the problem, essentially it's just going to make a bigger version of the exact same thing we're dealing with. Cranking up the juice is not always the solution. The problem that we need to address here is the overall placement. With placement being too high on this one, the top edge is going to absorb most of the heat. The filler material is going to stick to the edge up here, and we are going to experience a lack of fusion to the bottom plate. So it actually turns out our student wasn't too far off with this one. It's just the one really important variable of proper placement. We've seen what placement being too low looks like. Now we can see what happens when the placement is too high as well. Especially with this joint, it is really important that we get our placement just right in between these two examples. Looking at this example here that I did, landing the exact same variables just in between these two. This is where the magic and the consistency really happens with this joint. We get the filler material reaching all the way up to the top edge. It's very important to get adequate reinforcement up there, but we want the bottom edge to be smooth and blended like this example here. This all takes a really close attention to detail while you are welding. And as you are welding, make sure that when you add filler material to the mix, it's reaching all the way up to the top edge. The profile should not be concave at all. We want at least this amount of reinforcement here. A little more is about perfect, just as long as we're not overfilling and the bottom edge is still blending in very smoothly. Silky smooth. So after making a few adjustments with this exercise, my student was able to bang out some examples like we see here. As I said, with this exercise, he was already off to a really good start. A lot of what he was doing was already really good. It was just a matter of understanding the placement of it a little bit more. And when he really got the details perfectly, we can see the results that came after it. So in an episode that I did just a couple weeks ago, we broke down the difference between these two welds here. The difference between these two was also very important. There's a lot of information in that episode and a lot of good resources, so go make sure you watch that one next. It's got some free textbook pages that you can download and print off for yourself. Go hit that episode next. Do a random act of kindness for a stranger today. My name is Dusty. Fill and chill. We'll talk soon. Peace.